In the cold ground of interior Alaska, someone once buried a child only a few weeks old, around 11,500 years ago. Who her people were, where they came from, where they were headed, all of it stayed silent for thousands of years. But her body had been carrying the record the whole time, written into her DNA, and when scientists finally learned to read it, the people it pointed to were a founding population no one had ever named. In 2026, a team in Barcelona read the largest version ever assembled, and it did not match the textbook. Here is the strange thing about ancestry. The whole family tree of two continents, every migration, every split, every long walk into country no human had seen before, was carried forward inside the bodies of the people who lived it. It survived in cells, carried in the body from one generation to the next, long before anyone could write a word of it down. A child buried in the Alaskan permafrost, an elder living in Patagonia today, both of them holding a document that describes where their people had been. For most of history, no one could open that document. We could dig up bones and stone tools and campfires, and we could argue about the dates. What we could not do was read the book itself. Go back to that Alaskan infant for a second, because she is the clearest example of what reading it can do. Her burial site in interior Alaska is thousands of years old, and when researchers sequenced her genome, they did not just find an early Native American, they found a branch. Her people had split off from the rest very early and stayed separate, a distinct founding group that scientists named the ancient Beringians. We have no villages for them, no faces, no names they called themselves. We know they existed almost entirely because of the DNA of one child, an entire people recovered from a single reading. That is the power we are dealing with, and it is why the new map matters so much. To understand what the map broke, you have to understand the clean, confident line it broke. For a long time, the story went like this. Sometime in the deep past, small groups of hunter-gatherers in Siberia and East Asia moved north and east, following the animals, until they reached a stretch of land that no longer exists. During the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice that sea levels dropped and the floor of the Bering Strait rose into the open air. For thousands of years, there was a wide, cold grassland connecting Asia to Alaska, a place we now call Beringia. People walked across it, that part is settled, and nothing in the new map touches it. What happened on that land bridge is where it gets interesting. The genetic evidence points to a founding population that broke away from its East Asian relatives perhaps 25,000 years ago, and then did something unexpected. It stopped. For a long stretch, that group seems to have stayed put in the Beringian region, isolated, cut off from the people it had left behind and from the continent it had not yet entered. Researchers call it the Beringian standstill, a long pause in the cold, and during it, this population slowly became genetically its own thing. Only later did it move south, and as it moved, it divided into a northern branch and a southern branch that fan out into most of the native peoples of the Americas. For most of the 20th century, though, the arrival itself was pinned to one tidy date. The story was called Clovis First, named for a distinctive style of stone spear point first identified near Clovis, New Mexico. The Clovis toolkit shows up across North America right around 13,000 years ago. And the reasoning was simple. These were the oldest tools anyone could find, so these must have been the first people. First toolkit, first Americans. One clean line into the continent. The problem is that the line kept breaking. Down in southern Chile, at a waterlogged site called Monte Verde, archaeologists found the remains of a settlement older than Clovis by more than 1,000 years, preserved so well that there were still tent stakes and chewed plants in the mud. If people were living at the far southern end of South America before Clovis even appeared up north, then Clovis could not have been first. And Monte Verde, was only the start. Site after site began pushing the human presence in the Americas earlier, past that clean 13,000-year wall. Then came the footprints. At White Sands in New Mexico, researchers found human tracks pressed into what had once been the soft mud of an ancient lake edge. When they dated the seeds and pollen buried in the layers around those prints, the numbers came back staggering. Somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That is not a few centuries before Clovis. That is many thousands of years before it. In the teeth of the last ice age, when the standard models said the route south should have been blocked by walls of ice. The White Sands dates were challenged the moment they landed, and the criticism was fair. The aquatic plants used for the first dates can absorb old carbon from the water and read artificially old. So the team went back. They dated terrestrial pollen from the same layers. They ran a completely separate method based on the last time berry quartz had seen sunlight. Independent laboratories checked the work, and the age held. People were standing at White Sands more than 20,000 years ago. In one set of prints, a woman and a child walking together, the child's small tracks appearing and disappearing as she was carried and set down. In another, hunters tracking a giant ground sloth across the flats. Those prints humanized the whole debate in a way bones never quite manage. You are looking at an ordinary afternoon, more than 20,000 years ago, a mother and a tired child crossing the mud together. There is still a real argument about how those early people got south at all. One idea is an inland corridor that opened between the ice sheets. Another is a coastal route, moving down the Pacific shoreline by boat and on foot, a path that would now sit underwater and out of reach of archaeologists. That debate is genuinely unsettled, and it is worth being honest that we do not have it pinned down. So by the time the new map arrived, the confident single line was already in trouble. The first Americans were older than we thought. They seemed to have arrived by more than one path, and the tidy dates kept getting pushed back. What the field still lacked was the actual document, the genome of the people themselves, read at the scale of the whole hemisphere. For the Americas, that document had been almost entirely blank. Global genetic databases are built overwhelmingly from people of European ancestry, and Native American populations were among the most underrepresented on Earth. Whole regions of human diversity were simply missing from the record. If you wanted to study Amazonian ancestry, you often had to lean on one or two groups to represent an entire rainforest. The study published in 2026 set out to fix exactly that. It was led by the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, a joint center of Spain's National Research Council and Pompeu Fabra University, working with the University of Sao Paulo and researchers at Arizona State as part of a long effort called the Indigenous American Genomic Diversity Project. And the scale is what makes it matter. The team assembled genomes from 199 indigenous individuals reaching from North America down to Patagonia. Of those, 128 were newly sequenced, high-coverage whole genomes drawn from 45 populations across 8 Latin American countries, spanning dozens of distinct language families. Each genome was read deeply, around 44 times over, enough to call individual variants with real confidence. To reach further back in time, the team folded in ancient DNA as well, including genomes from the Sambaqui shell mound builders of coastal Brazil, so they could anchor the living data to the deep past. When they counted what was in those genomes, they found more than 12 million single-letter variants, and around 1.43 million of them, well over a million, had never been recorded in any of the big public databases. Not in the major reference collections that most of human genetics is built on. That works out to roughly 11,000 novel variants sitting inside each individual genome, variation the rest of the field had never even seen. That blank spot on the map amounted to a continent's worth of missing text. That gap causes a second problem, and this one is medical. When doctors read your genome to estimate your risk for a disease or to predict how you will respond to a drug, they compare you against those same reference databases. If your ancestry is barely represented in them, the predictions get worse, and the people they get worse for are the ones already least served by the system. A variant that is common and harmless in one population can look like a dangerous anomaly simply because no one ever recorded how ordinary it is. Filling in a million missing variants is the kind of thing that quietly changes who modern medicine actually works for. The researchers are blunt about it. Better representation here benefits indigenous communities directly, and it benefits everyone else too, because a fuller catalog of human variation is a better tool for all of us. If this is the kind of story you came here for, the real layer underneath the famous one, take a second and subscribe, because this is the channel that reads the paper instead of the press release. Now let me show you what the reading actually said. Start with the migrations, because that is where the map does its most direct rewriting. When the team tried to explain the ancestry of present-day South Americans using just two ancestral sources, the math refused, and not by a little. Two streams could not account for what is actually sitting in living genomes. The data demanded a minimum of 3 distinct ancestral lines, arriving in 3 separate dispersals. The picture that comes out looks something like this. There is the deep initial peopling, the descendants of that Beringian founding group, spreading south and splitting into the northern and southern branches. Then, around 9,000 years ago, a second wave of migration moves in and partially replaces some of those earlier groups, reshaping the mix across large parts of the continent. But the youngest of the 3 is the real surprise. The map shows a later wave that pushed out of Mesoamerica down into South America and the Caribbean only about 1,300 years ago. On the scale of this story, that is almost yesterday, and it had been genetically invisible until now. Its signature shows up in South American populations living today, and it shows up in ancient remains from the Caribbean, which is how the team could trace where it came from and roughly when it moved. Sit with that for a second. This is not a lab in Barcelona speculating about a lost tribe. This is a movement of real people across real country written into the DNA of their descendants that simply could not be seen until the record got large enough to hold it. The map didn't invent that migration. It recovered one that had been there the whole time. And then it corrected a mistake we had been building on for years. Remember those 1 or 2 groups that kept getting used to represent the whole Amazon? 2 communities in particular, the Caratiana and the Suru of Brazil, had become the default proxies for lowland South American diversity in study after study. The new data shows they are poor representatives, and the reason is quietly devastating. Both groups carry unusually high levels of inbreeding in their genomes, long identical stretches inherited from a small pool of ancestors, and they sit apart even from their close neighbors. For a long time, that distinctiveness got read as something ancient and deep. It is not. The map shows it is recent. It is the genetic shadow of population collapse of communities cut down to a handful of survivors within the last few centuries, after European contact. So this was not just new information. For years, the field had been treating the fingerprint of a catastrophe as if it were the ordinary, timeless face of Amazonian ancestry. And the map is what caught the error. That catastrophe is the hardest thing the genome records, and the map does not look away from it. By the team's estimate, colonization cut the indigenous population of the Americas by something on the order of 90%. 9 in 10. A loss so total that the genetic diversity of the entire hemisphere today is only a fraction of what it was before contact. When you read these genomes, you are reading survivors, and the shape of the survival is right there in the data, in those long inbred stretches, in the branches that narrow to almost nothing. And here is the part that makes the whole thing ache a little. Even through that collapse, the map finds continuity. In some regions, the same genetic thread runs unbroken for more than 9,000 years, from ancient remains straight through to the people living there now. The population was cut down brutally, and still the line was never fully severed. The honest version of this story has to hold both of those at once. Now, for the deepest mystery, the one the map confirms, but cannot solve. When researchers look closely at the genomes of some indigenous South Americans, they find a faint but real signal, around 2% of the genome, that points somewhere no known migration route should reach. It shows a genetic affinity with populations in Australasia, Aboriginal Australians, the peoples of New Guinea, groups in the Andaman Islands, off the coast of Southeast Asia, people on the far side of the Pacific. This is not brand new. A version of this signal has puzzled researchers for years. But the new map does something important with it. It finds the signal in South American individuals reaching back more than 10,000 years, in strikingly similar proportions across time. That consistency suggests this is not some recent accident. It points instead to an ancient, unsampled population somewhere back in Asia, a ghost we have never found directly. That carried this Australasian affinity and mixed into the ancestors of some Americans before they ever arrived. The team gives that hypothesized ancestor a name drawn from an indigenous language, Waipaikuera, roughly meaning the ancestors. And this is exactly where honesty has to take over from drama. We do not know who they were. We have never sequenced them. We can see their echo in living genomes and in ancient ones, and we cannot yet point to them on any map. The signal is real, and it is well evidenced. What it actually means is still open. There is one more layer written into these genomes, older than any journey into the Americas. Like everyone whose ancestors left Africa, these populations carry DNA from archaic humans. From Neanderthals and Denisovans, somewhere between 1 and 3% of their DNA. That is roughly the same amount other populations carry. But the pattern is distinctive, and some of that inherited archaic DNA turns out to be doing real work. The map finds signatures of natural selection, stretches of the genome that were favored because they helped people survive specific American environments. Genes tied to the immune system, to metabolism, to growth, to fertility. Think about what that means on the ground. Living in the thin air of the high Andes, where every breath carries less oxygen, is a genuine physiological problem, and the genome shows populations that solved it. Surviving the dense disease pressure of the Amazon is another, and the genome shows the immune system being reshaped to meet it. The book is not just a travelogue of where people went. It is a record of how their bodies changed in order to stay. And this is the point where a lot of channels would forget something, so I want to be clear about it. Every one of these findings came out of the bodies of living people. This was not data lifted from specimens. The project spent close to a decade building partnerships with indigenous communities, from the Mapuche in Argentine Patagonia to groups across 8 countries. Participants gave informed consent, sometimes as individuals, sometimes at the level of a whole community. And when the results came back, the team returned them to the communities they came from in plain language booklets and presentations, not just in a paywall journal. The researchers are careful to say the obvious thing that still needs saying. These populations are not one uniform group. They differ in history, in culture, in biology. And the map is a record of real peoples, not a specimen drawer. That care is part of why the science holds up in the first place. So the map redraws the picture. It adds a migration we could not see, corrects a proxy we leaned on, reads the collapse honestly, and confirms a signal from the other side of the world. And now comes the part that junk channels always skip, the part where a real reading of the evidence has to admit what it did not settle. It did not settle when the first people arrived. The paper's own framing puts the main migration into the continent around 15,000 years ago. But those footprints at White Sands are more than 20,000 years old and holding. The map does not reconcile those two numbers. The oldest chapter of the story, the actual moment humans first stood on this land, is still an open-argued range, and anyone who tells you it is solved is selling you something. It did not explain the deep Australasian signal. It confirmed it, dated it, and made it much harder to dismiss, and then left it every bit as unexplained as before, only now with better evidence that the mystery is genuinely there. And it opened movements it cannot yet narrate. The map can now see the outline of migrations that were invisible before, but seeing the outline of a migration still doesn't tell you why it happened. Why did people push out of Mesoamerica 1,300 years ago? What were they leaving? What were they moving toward? The genome tells us they moved, but not what they were chasing or what they were leaving behind. The record got bigger and the mystery got deeper at the very same time. Which brings us back to the child in the Alaskan ground. She was buried by people who loved her in a world with no writing, no way to send a message forward, except the one running quietly in her own cells. She could not have known the record was there. Neither could the woman walking with her own child across the White Sands mud 20,000 years before her. Neither could any of the generations in between, moving across a continent no human had ever mapped, carrying the whole story forward without ever being able to read a single word of it. The first Americans were people, thousands of years of them, walking into a world no one had described, and their story was written in the only place that could keep it safe. And it waited there in the dark until a machine could finally turn the pages. We are only just beginning to read it, and the little we can read already tells us we knew far less than we thought. So here is what I want from you. If you believe there is a real story buried under the famous one, subscribe and stay for the next one. And in the comments, tell me what you think this map still isn't telling us. Because right now, the honest truth is that it isn't telling us everything, and we are only just getting started.